The elevator doors closed, the building was empty, and Amelia Hart had exactly 4 seconds before the cable snapped. She heard it, that high-pitched metallic scream that doesn't belong in any functioning machine. And in the half-second before the floor dropped out from under her wheelchair, she understood with absolute clarity that this was not a malfunction. Someone had planned this. The emergency brake caught at the last possible moment, slamming the car to a violent stop between floors. Amelia sat in the darkness, hands white-knuckled on her armrests, blood from a cut on her temple running down the side of her face. 13 bodyguards had already walked away from this job. Nobody could blame the 14th for doing the same. Except the 14th wasn't the type to walk away from anything. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because the story you're about to hear is the kind that keeps you up at night. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and I want to know, what city, what country are you watching from? Leave it in the comments below. Every single one of those messages tells me this story has traveled further than I ever imagined. Now stay with me. Because this is only the beginning. The job listing didn't exist. No posting on any security firm database, no referral through the usual channels, nothing on the private contractor networks that former military personnel used when they were looking for high-dollar protection work. The offer came through a single phone call to a number Ethan Carter hadn't given out in 3 years. And the voice on the other end spoke for less than 90 seconds before Ethan said yes. He didn't ask about the salary. He didn't ask about benefits or hours or whether there was a signing bonus. He asked one question: when do you need me to start? The answer was tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. He spent that evening at the kitchen table helping his daughter Sophia finish a book report on a novel she hadn't actually read, which meant he read her the summary out loud while she wrote it in her own handwriting and told herself it wasn't cheating because she was still doing the writing part. Sophia was 9 years old and already had a lawyer's instinct for finding loopholes. Ethan loved that about her, even when it drove him insane. "Dad," she said, without looking up from the page, "you're doing that thing where you go somewhere else in your head. I'm right here. You're right here, but you're not." She pressed the eraser end of her pencil against her chin, a habit she'd picked up from him. "Is it the new job?" "It's always the new job. Is this one dangerous?" He looked at her for a moment, at the way she held her pencil, the small crease between her eyebrows that appeared whenever she was being serious, the way she looked exactly like her mother and nothing like him at all. He thought about lying. He thought about the 13 other men and women who had taken this assignment and then, one by one, stopped taking anyone's calls. "Every job has some risk," he said. "This one's got a little more than usual." Sophia nodded slowly, like she was filing that information away for later. "Are you going to be okay?" "I'm always okay." "You broke your collarbone last year." "That was one time." She gave him a look that was startlingly adult for a 9-year-old, returned to her book report, and said nothing else about it. That was the thing about Sophia. She didn't push. She absorbed information and waited, and the waiting was somehow worse than if she'd just argued with him directly. Ethan sat across from her for another hour, pretending to read something on his phone, not reading anything at all. Sterling Technologies occupied the top 11 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago that seemed, from certain angles, to be trying to stab the sky. Ethan arrived at 5:45 in the morning, 15 minutes early, because arriving early was not a professional courtesy for him. It was a reflex. He stood outside the lobby in a jacket that wasn't warm enough for the temperature and looked at the building the way he used to look at structures he was about to enter under fire, noting the exits, the blind spots, the angles from adjacent rooftops, the rhythm of foot traffic on the surrounding block. The security desk inside was manned by a guard named Marcus, who had been at the position for 11 years and who looked at Ethan with the particular expression of a man watching someone walk voluntarily into a burning building. "You're the new one," Marcus said. "Ethan Carter." "I know who you are." Marcus didn't extend his hand. He slid a visitor's badge across the counter. "You talked to anyone yet? About the others?" "I heard some things." 13 people, man." Marcus kept his voice low, though the lobby was empty. 13. You know what all of them had in common? They were all good at their jobs. Ramos was ex-Secret Service. Kim had 15 years private sector, never lost a principal. These weren't rookies who got spooked. Ethan clipped the badge to his jacket. What happened to them? Some quit. 3 just stopped showing up. 1 transferred overseas on 2 days' notice and hasn't answered a call since. Marcus paused. Word is 2 of them tried to report something internally before they left. Nothing came of it. Report what? Nobody knows. Marcus looked at him steadily. Or nobody's saying. Ethan nodded, picked up his bag, and took the elevator to the 47th floor. Amelia Hart was already in her office when he arrived, which surprised him. The briefing materials had said she typically arrived at 7. It was 6:02. She was behind a desk that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never actually used a desk, all clean angles and deliberate emptiness, and she was reading something on a tablet with her reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead in a way that suggested she'd forgotten they were there. She was 30 years old. She looked in that moment closer to 45. Not in her face, which was unlined, but in something around her eyes. The particular quality of someone who had been tired for a long time and had made a kind of peace with it. The wheelchair was a high-end model, custom-fitted, and she moved it with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had spent 6 months learning to make it an extension of herself rather than an obstacle. She didn't look up when Ethan came in. "Close the door," she said. He closed it. "Sit down." He sat. She set the tablet face down on the desk and looked at him properly for the first time. Her eyes were dark and very direct, the kind of eyes that were accustomed to reading people quickly and filing them under categories. He got the impression she was filing him right now. "You didn't ask about the salary," she said. "Money's not the issue." "What is the issue?" "The assignment." She held his gaze for a moment, then, "You read the file." "I did." "And you came anyway." "I did." She leaned back slightly. "Every single person who took this job before you left because they got scared? Or because someone got to them? I don't know which yet." Her voice was flat, professionally neutral, but there was something underneath it. Not quite bitterness, not quite grief. Something that had been both of those things once and had calcified into something harder. "I have enemies inside this building. I don't know exactly who, I don't know exactly why, and I don't know what they're willing to do. What I do know is that 6 months ago my car went off the Franklin overpass at 60 miles an hour, and the official report says the cause was driver error." She paused. "My driver had 18 years of experience and had never had an accident in his life." Ethan said nothing. "So," Amelia said, "you still want the job?" "I took the job." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a reaction, more like the suppression of one. She picked up her tablet again. "Your predecessor," she said, "lasted 9 days. The one before him, 4. You'll have full access to the security systems, staff schedules, and building records. My assistant Claire will give you whatever you need." She glanced at him over the top of the tablet. "One rule. You don't ask me personal questions. You don't form opinions about my choices. You're here to keep me alive. That's it." "Understood." "Good." She returned to the tablet. "You can start by reviewing the incident reports from the last 6 months. All of them. Not just the summaries. The full reports." Ethan stood. He was almost at the door when she spoke again without looking up. "Mr. Carter." "Yeah." "The last guard who read those reports handed in his resignation the next morning." She turned a page. "I thought you should know." He left without responding because there wasn't anything useful to say. He read the reports. All of them. It took most of the morning, hunched over a borrowed desk in the corner of the security office, while the day shift moved around him. He read everything twice: the formal incident reports, the follow-up memos, the maintenance logs, the witness statements, and by 11 o'clock he had the particular feeling he used to get in the field when he realized a situation was more complex than the initial briefing had indicated. The feeling wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like the moment before you step off a perfectly safe platform into water you can't see the bottom of. The incident reports were, on their surface, a collection of bad luck. Mechanical failures, Close calls that had been investigated, logged, and closed as accidents. A brake malfunction on Amelia's wheelchair that had been attributed to a manufacturing defect. A ceiling fixture that had pulled free from its mounting that maintenance had blamed on corroded hardware. Small things. Individually, each one was explainable. Together, they formed a pattern that made the hair on the back of Ethan's neck stand up. He pulled up the security footage for each incident. Then he pulled up the footage for the 24-hour windows surrounding each incident. Then he started making a list. By noon, the list had 11 items on it. He found Claire Donovan, Amelia's executive assistant, in the outer office. A woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the permanently alert expression of someone who had been managing crises long enough that they'd stopped registering as crises. "I need the room booking records for the last 6 months," Ethan said. "Every executive meeting, every board session, every internal presentation. I need to know which rooms were used." Well, Claire looked at him over her glasses. "That's an unusual request." "I know." She studied him for a moment. "The others who asked questions," she said carefully, "didn't last long." "I'm aware." "I'm not saying that to discourage you." She held his gaze. "I'm saying it because I want you to understand what you're walking into." "I already understand." Something in her face eased slightly. She turned to her computer and began pulling records. "I'll have them ready in an hour." "Thank you." He was turning to leave when she said quietly, "Mr. Carter, be careful who you trust in this building. That includes people who seem friendly." He nodded and went back to his desk. The records confirmed what he'd suspected. Every executive meeting over the previous 4 months had taken place in one of 3 conference rooms. But cross-referencing with the security system logs told a different story. The cameras in those 3 rooms had experienced scheduled maintenance outages that coincided almost exactly with the meeting times. Not every meeting, not even most meetings, but the ones that mattered, the ones where, based on the agenda logs, sensitive financial and operational decisions had been made. Someone had been making sure those conversations weren't recorded. Ethan sat with that information for a long time. Then he opened a new document and started mapping it out. The meetings, the camera outages, the incidents, the timeline. It was slow, methodical work, the kind of thing that looked like nothing from the outside and was everything from where he was sitting. At 2:30 in the afternoon, he went to find Amelia. She was in a board prep session, 4 executives around a table, tablets and coffee, the particular energy of people performing productivity for each other. Ethan stood in the doorway. He didn't interrupt. He watched the room, not Amelia, but the others. The way they sat relative to her, the micro-expressions when she spoke. The man at the far end of the table, mid-50s, silver-haired, who kept his face perfectly neutral in a way that wasn't natural. Neutrality like that took practice. He made a note of the name placard in front of him. Adrian Monroe, Executive Vice President, Strategic Operations. At 4 o'clock, something happened that pulled him out of his research entirely. He was crossing the lobby to check a camera angle he'd noted earlier when he heard the sound. A mechanical whine that didn't belong, a pitch that was wrong in a very specific way, coming from the direction of the stairwell adjacent to the elevator bank. He moved without thinking, pure instinct from years of operating on sound before sight, and he came around the corner to find Amelia's wheelchair rolling toward the top of the staircase at a speed that was not voluntary. She was fighting the manual brake lever, which was not responding. He crossed the space in 4 strides, got both hands on the back of the chair, and stopped it with his body weight 2 feet from the edge. The impact jarred his shoulder. The chair rocked forward and then back and then was still. The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. "You're okay," he said. He said it matter-of-factly, not as comfort, because she didn't look like the kind of person who wanted comfort. She looked like someone who was furious. "The brake?" she started. "I know, I heard it from across the lobby." She twisted to look at him. Her face was controlled, but her hands, still gripping the armrests, were not. "That's the 3rd time something like this has happened." "I know that too." He kept his hands on the chair until he was certain it was stable. "I need you to listen to me for a minute." "I'm listening." "I've been going through the incident reports and the security logs. There's a pattern. The camera outages, the room bookings, the timing of every incident. It's not random. None of it is random. She was very still. Whoever is doing this, Ethan said, knows your schedule, knows the building systems, and has access to security infrastructure. This isn't someone from outside the company. Amelia looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the lobby was beginning to fill with end-of-day foot traffic, people moving past without a second glance. A normal Tuesday afternoon in a glass tower in Chicago. I suspected, she said quietly. You suspected and didn't say anything. I suspected and had no proof. Her jaw was set, and every time I tried to raise concerns internally, the investigation went nowhere. The board told me I was under stress. My legal team told me to be careful about making accusations without evidence. She laughed, once, a short and not particularly amused sound. One of them suggested I see a therapist. What about the police? What about them? She said it flatly. I reported the crash. They investigated. Driver error, case closed. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. You're the first person in 6 months who has said the words I suspected out loud. Everyone else looks at the incidents and sees a streak of bad luck. Or they see what they're being paid to see. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I want to pull the maintenance records for your wheelchair, he said. All of them, going back to when it was first issued, and I want access to the vehicle report from the crash. The vehicle report was sealed. I know, I want it anyway. She searched his face. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find enough of it because she nodded. I'll call my attorney tonight. Don't use your office phone or your company email. Something passed through her eyes. A flash of something that might have been fear and was immediately replaced by something harder. All right. He stepped back, giving her room. She adjusted the brake lever on her wheelchair. A new one, he noticed, would need to be installed tomorrow, and turned toward the elevator. She stopped before she pressed the button. Mr. Carter? Yeah. Why did you take this job? She didn't look at him when she asked it. She was staring at the elevator doors. Not the professional reason, the actual reason. He thought about it. He thought about Sophia asking him the same question in a different way across a kitchen table with a book report between them. Because someone needed to, he said. She pressed the button. The doors opened. She rolled forward. That's either a very honest answer, she said, or a very rehearsed one. The doors closed behind her. Ethan stood in the lobby for a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the security office. He had 7 more hours of footage to review before morning, and the distinct feeling that whatever he was going to find in it was going to make the brake malfunction look like the simplest problem on the list. He was right. He just didn't know yet exactly how right. The maintenance records for Amelia's wheelchair arrived at 7:14 the following morning, delivered by Claire in a manila folder that she set on Ethan's desk without a word and then left without being asked. He'd been in the building since 5:30, which meant he'd been awake since 4, which meant he'd slept for roughly 3 hours on a cot in the back of the security office that one of the overnight guards had pointed out to him with the particular sympathy of someone who recognized a man settling in for a long campaign. He opened the folder and started reading. The chair had been serviced 4 times since Amelia was discharged from the rehabilitation facility 8 months ago. 3 of those services were routine: tire pressure, battery calibration, standard checks. The 4th, logged 6 weeks ago, was listed as a brake system inspection following a reported stiffness in the manual override. The technician's name on the work order was someone called D. Paulson, employed by the contracted medical equipment company that handled Sterling Technologies' accessibility services. Ethan ran the name through the company's HR database, which Claire had quietly given him access to the previous evening. D. Paulson did not exist in the system. He sat with that for a moment. Then he pulled the access logs for the building's loading dock, the entry point used by outside contractors, and searched the date of the 4th service. The log showed a badge scan at 9:47 a.m. under a contractor code that matched the equipment company. He pulled the camera footage for that timestamp. The camera covering the loading dock had experienced a 40-minute outage beginning at 9:32 a.m. He wrote the name D. Paulson at the top of a fresh page and circled it. He told Amelia at 8 o'clock in her office, with the door closed and her phone face down on the desk between them because he'd asked her to put it there, and she'd done it without argument, which told him she was already thinking along the same lines. The technician who serviced your brake system 6 weeks ago doesn't exist in any company record, he said. The camera that would have recorded his entry was down during the entire window he was in the building. Amelia's expression didn't change dramatically. She absorbed it the way she seemed to absorb most things, by going very still and then very focused. The brake failure yesterday could have been introduced 6 weeks ago and set to fail under a specific load condition. A ramp, a turn at a certain angle, proximity to a drop. He paused. Near a staircase. She looked at her hands in her lap. They knew my route. Your standard routes are in the security briefing documents. Whoever has access to those has access to everything. She looked up. Which is half the executive floor. I'm going to need the distribution list for those documents. Every person who received them in the last year. She pulled her keyboard toward her and started typing without being asked. He watched her work. The efficient, slightly impatient way she moved through the system, pulling files, not asking for help. There was something in how she operated that reminded him of people he'd worked alongside in the field, the ones who dealt with bad information by moving faster, not by freezing. There are 23 people on this list, she said, turning the monitor toward him. He scanned it. Adrian Monroe's name was third from the top. I need you to behave completely normally today, Ethan said. Same schedule, same meeting, same everything. Don't change anything and don't tell anyone we talked about this. She gave him a look that was difficult to interpret, something between irritation and something more complicated. You think someone on that list is watching how I respond to information? I think someone on that list is watching everything. She turned the monitor back. Fine. She picked up her coffee, which had gone cold. I have a board prep at 9 and a shareholder call at 11. Completely normal Tuesday. She said it with a flatness that wasn't quite sarcasm and wasn't quite resignation. Something in between. I'll be in the room. You're always in the room, she said. That's your job. He stood to leave. Ms. Hart. Amelia. She said it without looking up from her screen. If you're going to be in every room I'm in, you're going to use my first name. The formality is exhausting. He nodded once and left. The board prep at 9 was where he first understood the full shape of what he was dealing with. There were 6 people in the room. Amelia, Monroe, 2 other VPs, the company's general counsel, and a financial officer named Petra Walsh, who spent most of the meeting looking at her tablet and contributing 3 sentences in 40 minutes. Ethan stood in the corner near the door, which was where he always stood, visible enough to be a deterrent, far enough back not to be intrusive, which was a balance he'd learned over years of close protection work that most people never noticed him striking. He watched Monroe. He'd watched Monroe briefly the previous afternoon, but briefly was different from 40 minutes in a contained space. Monroe was the kind of man who understood how to perform authority, the measured pace of his speech, the way he let silences develop before he spoke into them, the very deliberate way he positioned himself at the table so that he was always slightly more central than his actual seat should have placed him. These were learned behaviors, practiced ones, and they worked. The other executives oriented toward Monroe the way people orient toward the loudest sound in a room, not because he was loud, but because he'd made himself the gravitational center. But there was something else. When Amelia spoke, and she spoke well, clearly, with the kind of compressed precision that came from someone who'd learned that most boardrooms would give her less patience than her male counterparts, Monroe's face did a thing. Not a big thing. A small one. A half second of something that wasn't agreement and wasn't disagreement. It was a kind of waiting, the expression of someone who already knew how the conversation was going to end and was mildly interested in watching it get there. Ethan had seen that expression before. He'd seen it on people who were holding information that changed the meaning of everything being said around them. After the meeting, while the others filed out, he watched Monroe stop in the doorway and exchange a few words with the financial officer, Walsh. Too quiet to hear from across the room. Walsh nodded twice, didn't smile, left. Monroe glanced back at Amelia once, just a look, nothing loaded in it that you could point to, and then was gone. Ethan stayed in the corner until the room was empty. Then he went and stood exactly where Monroe had been standing when he'd spoken to Walsh, and he looked at the room from that angle, and he thought about what a person could see and hear from that position during a meeting. Which seats, which screens, which documents left open on which tablets. He pulled out his phone and made a note. The shareholder call at 11 ran long, spilling into the lunch hour. Ethan spent the extra time walking the 47th floor in a methodical grid he'd started laying out the previous day. Not looking for anything specific, not yet, but building the spatial memory that he'd always considered essential before anything else. The shape of a place, the rhythms of it, where people walked versus where they didn't, and why. He found the irregularity on his third pass through the east corridor. It was a camera, or rather, it was a camera housing, the same style as the building's standard surveillance units, mounted in the correct position, angled in the correct direction. But the indicator light that blinked on every other camera on the floor was not blinking on this one. He stopped beneath it and looked up. The housing was clean, no dust, recently handled. He checked the security system inventory from his phone. The camera at that location was listed as operational. He photographed it from 3 angles and kept walking, his pace unchanged, his expression unchanged. Because if someone was watching feeds somewhere in this building, they would be watching for someone who found something and reacted to it, and he was very practiced at not reacting. He filed it in his head next to the D. Paulson entry and the loading dock footage and the distribution list and Monroe's expression in the boardroom and kept moving. He ate lunch at his desk, a sandwich from the building's cafeteria that tasted like it had been made by someone who'd been told to describe a sandwich from memory, and called Sophia's school to confirm she'd arrived safely, which was something he did every day regardless of whether he had any reason to be concerned, because that was the deal he'd made with himself after her mother died. You checked. You always checked, even when everything was fine. Sophia's teacher told him she was fine. Sophia had apparently made an argument in class that morning that the book report assignment was structurally biased against people with different reading speeds, which the teacher described as an interesting perspective, in a tone that suggested she didn't entirely disagree. Ethan sat with that for a second, then went back to work. The elevator incident happened at 2:17 p.m. He knew the time exactly because he'd looked at his watch 30 seconds before it happened, when Amelia had stepped into the executive elevator alone while he was 20 feet away dealing with a brief, insistent question from a mid-level manager who'd appeared from nowhere and wanted to discuss a security protocol update that Ethan was fairly certain was not urgent. He'd cut the conversation short, turned, and was moving toward the elevator bank when he heard the sound. A grinding, mechanical protest. Too short to be a standard malfunction sound. Too sharp. Then silence. Then the floor indicator above the elevator doors freezing between 46 and 47. He was at the elevator panel within 4 seconds, pulling the emergency phone from its housing. The operator answered on the second ring. He gave his credentials and the car number and described what he'd heard, and the operator told him engineers were being dispatched, and that the car had safety systems that would hold it in position, and he said, "How long?" And the operator said 15 to 20 minutes, and he hung up. He went directly to the stairwell, took the stairs to 46, and found the maintenance access panel for the elevator shaft. It was unlocked. He noted that, filed it, and used it to confirm that the car was stable, sitting 3 feet below the 47th floor landing, perfectly level, not in any mechanical distress that he could detect. He went back up and knocked on the shaft access panel twice. From inside the car, muffled, "I'm here. Elevator's stable, engineers are on the way. 15 minutes. A pause. Okay. You hurt? No. Another pause. My coffee spilled. That's the priority right now. I'm being sarcastic, Mr. Carter. I know. 15 minutes. He stood by the doors until the engineers arrived. 2 of them, young, efficient, visibly uncomfortable with the situation in a way that suggested this elevator had not been scheduled for any maintenance in the near future. He watched them work the override and get the doors open, and watched Amelia roll the chair over the small gap between car and landing with the matter-of-fact steadiness she brought to all physical navigation. And then he watched the engineers exchange a look over their equipment cases that they clearly thought he hadn't seen. "What is it?" he said. The taller one shook his head. "We'll have a full report. What is it right now?" They looked at each other again. The shorter one said, "The car's governor cable has a clean cut in it. Not fraying, not wear." He paused. Cut. Ethan looked at Amelia. She had heard. She was holding her phone in her lap and looking at nothing in particular, and the expression on her face was the specific kind of controlled that takes everything a person has. File the report, Ethan said to the engineers. Don't discuss it internally before it's filed. Put it directly to facilities management in writing and copy the general counsel. He looked at both of them. If anyone asks you about this verbally before that report is filed, don't answer. Put everything in writing. The taller one nodded slowly. Is there something we should know? There's a lot you should know, Ethan said. Right now, the most important thing is that report. He waited until they moved toward the service elevator. Then he turned to Amelia. She looked up at him. Her eyes were steady, but she'd gone slightly pale in the way that happened when adrenaline dropped off, and there was a dried coffee stain on the right wheel of the chair that she hadn't addressed yet, which told him more than the steadiness of her eyes did. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. Someone cut the cable. Yes. While I was in the building, during business hours. She exhaled slowly. It means they're not waiting anymore, Ethan said. The break was passive. Set it and leave. This was active. Someone made a decision today to do this today. She was quiet for a moment. Why not something more direct? Because something more direct requires a clear line to a specific person. Mechanical failure has deniability. He paused. So far? She absorbed that. Then she straightened slightly in the chair, adjusted her grip on the wheels, and said, I have a call with the Pacific Rim Division at 3 o'clock. Amelia, I'm not canceling it. Her voice was even. If I cancel meetings every time something happens in this building, by next week I won't be leaving my office, and by the week after that I won't be CEO anymore. Which is, I suspect, the point. She held his gaze. So, 3 o'clock call. You'll be in the room. He recognized the argument because it was correct. I'll be in the room. He spent the time before 3 working backward through the elevator service history with the same method he'd used on the wheelchair records. The governor cable was listed in the most recent maintenance log as inspected and within normal wear parameters. The inspection had been logged 9 days ago. The technician was listed as J. Harmon, internal maintenance staff. J. Harmon, per HR records, had taken a leave of absence 11 days ago. 2 days before the inspection he'd allegedly performed. Ethan sat with that and felt the pattern tightening around him the way patterns did when they stopped being coincidences and started being architecture. Someone was constructing something. They had access to the building's systems, its personnel records, its maintenance logs. They had enough internal reach to create paper trails that looked right and fell apart only when you pulled the actual thread. This was not one person working alone. He thought about Monroe and about Walsh and about the distribution list with 23 names on it and about the camera on the east corridor that wasn't blinking. He thought about the loading dock footage that didn't exist. He thought about 13 bodyguards and what it would take to make 13 people leave or disappear. He was still thinking about it at 3 o'clock when he positioned himself in the corner of Amelia's office for the Pacific Rim call, and he was thinking about it when, 45 minutes into the call, a section of the decorative ceiling fixture above the credenza behind Amelia's desk gave way. It wasn't the whole thing. One section, ornamental, heavy, cast metal, dropped from a mounting that later inspection would show had been very recently, very deliberately, partially unbolted. It hit the credenza with a sound like a gunshot and took the corner of Amelia's laptop with it. Amelia had moved her chair 2 feet to the left approximately 30 seconds before it fell, to reach a document on the side table, and so the section that came down hit where she had been, not where she was. 30 seconds. Ethan was across the room before the echo finished. He put himself between Amelia and the ceiling without thinking about it, which was muscle memory, and then registered that the immediate threat was past, and looked up at the open mounting and felt something cold and very clear settle into his chest. The call was still going. The laptop screen showed the Pacific Rim Division's conference room, 8 confused faces looking at the sound, someone saying, "Miss Hart? Are you all right?" Amelia rolled herself back to the desk. She looked at the fallen fixture for one moment. Then she looked at the laptop screen. "I apologize," she said. "We had a minor facilities issue. Where were we?" At 6 in the evening, after the building had mostly emptied, and a facilities team had been through Amelia's office, and a security report had been filed that Ethan had written himself and trusted no one else to file, he sat in the small break room 2 doors down from the security office and did the thing he tried not to do in the middle of an operation, which was think about Sophia. She'd be at Mrs. Kowalski's next door, the arrangement they had for late nights. She'd have had dinner, probably done her homework, probably negotiated 15 extra minutes of reading time using an argument that was technically sound. She was fine. He was thinking about her because he'd come closer than he liked to not moving fast enough today. Not once, twice. The brake, the elevator, the ceiling. 3 things in a single day after weeks of calculated, slower-burning efforts. The tempo had changed, and when tempos changed, it was because something else had changed. A timeline, a pressure, a level of desperation. Someone inside Sterling Technologies was getting nervous. Nervous people made bigger moves. Bigger moves left more evidence. But bigger moves also hurt people, and the gap between finding the evidence and stopping the damage was where people got killed. He was still sitting there when the break room door opened and Amelia rolled in. She looked at him sitting at the small table with a cold cup of coffee and no lights on except the one over the sink, and she didn't say anything for a moment. "You didn't go home," she said. "I don't go home until you do. I was going to work late." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "You've been here since before 6 this morning." "Yeah." She moved to the counter and poured herself a glass of water and drank half of it and set it down. She didn't leave. She turned and looked at the wall for a moment, which he'd already understood was something she did when she was processing something she wasn't sure yet how to say. 3 incidents, she said. 1 day. Yes. They're not being patient anymore. No. She turned to look at him directly. There was something different in her face from this morning. Not fear, but something adjacent to it. The particular quality of a person who'd been holding a certain kind of distance deliberately and was finding it harder to maintain. What changed? What did we do that changed their timeline? I don't think it's us. He thought about it. I think something changed on their end, a deadline, a pressure point, something that made waiting more dangerous for them than acting. What kind of deadline? The quarterly board review is in 3 weeks. He'd checked. If they can remove you before then, they control the agenda. They control the vote on the operational restructuring that's been tabled since the crash. She went still. The restructuring that your predecessor blocked for 2 years, she said slowly, the one that would effectively give the operations division independent budget authority. She was quiet for a moment. Adrian Monroe runs operations. I know. She looked at him with an expression that was not surprise. She'd known or suspected or something between the two, but that carried the weight of a thing confirmed that you'd hoped not to confirm. How long have you known? I've suspected since yesterday. I don't have proof. He paused. Not yet. She nodded once. She picked up her water glass and finished it. She set it in the sink. Go home, she said. See your daughter. He looked at her. You have a daughter, she said. I saw the school calendar notification on your phone yesterday when you were looking something up. Sophia, right? She caught his expression. I'm not trying to intrude. I'm saying you have a person waiting for you and I have a driver and a locked apartment and you've been here for 13 hours. She met his eyes. Go home, Mr. Carter. Ethan. A very slight correction, like she was trying out the name. I'll be here in the morning. He stood. He picked up the cold coffee and poured it down the sink. He looked at her for a moment, this woman who'd had 3 attempts on her life today and was standing in a break room calmly telling him to go be with his kid. And he thought about what it cost a person to be that composed, what it took out of them that wasn't visible. Lock the apartment door, he said. Both locks. Obviously. And don't take the elevator. She looked at him. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across her face. Not humor exactly, but something that remembered what humor felt like. Good night, Ethan. He left. But he sat in the parking garage for 40 minutes reviewing footage on his phone before he actually drove away, because the day had taught him that when the pace accelerated, the gaps between incidents got shorter and the next one was already being prepared somewhere in the machinery of this building by someone who was running out of patience and running out of time. He wanted to be ready before they ran out of both. The shooting happened on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the ceiling fixture came down. In those 11 days, Ethan had slept an average of 4 hours a night, consumed more bad coffee than he could account for, and built a timeline on a legal pad that now ran to 14 pages. He kept the legal pad in his jacket pocket and the jacket on his body at all times, including the 2 nights he'd spent on the security office cot because leaving the building had felt like a risk he couldn't afford. Sophia had called him on the second night and asked if he was eating real food, and he'd said yes, and she'd said, "Dad, I can tell when you're lying." And he'd promised her a real dinner that weekend and meant it, and then worked until 3 in the morning cross-referencing employee access logs against the maintenance schedule. The timeline had grown into something that kept him awake not because it was incomplete, but because of how complete it was becoming. In the week and a half since the 3-incident day, the overt attempts had stopped. No more brake failures, no more elevator cables, no more ceiling fixtures. The sudden quiet was not reassuring. Ethan had been in enough situations to know that a pause in activity didn't mean the activity had ended. It meant someone was preparing something larger, and the preparation took time. He'd told Amelia this, and she'd said, "I know," with the clipped certainty of someone who was trying to function normally inside a situation that was not normal at all. She was doing it, mostly. She was showing up, running meetings, taking calls, performing the ordinary business of running a company in front of a board that had started looking at her differently, with a particular kind of attentiveness that Ethan read as circling. 3 board members had requested individual calls with Monroe in the past week. He'd tracked the meeting requests through the calendar system, which Claire had quietly given him red access to under a service account that wouldn't show up on Monroe's standard audit. Claire had not asked him why he needed access. She'd set it up in 4 minutes and handed him the credentials on a slip of paper that she then put directly through a shredder. He'd decided at that point that Claire Donovan was one of the few people in the building he trusted at all. He told Amelia this. "I've trusted Claire for 6 years," Amelia had said. They were in her office, early morning, the city still dark through the windows. "She's the only person in this building who's never made me feel like the wheelchair was a qualifier." A qualifier for what? For whether my opinion counts. She'd said it without self-pity, just as information. You'd be surprised how many people who would never say anything out loud still manage to communicate that they're waiting to see if I'm going to be okay. Like disability is a performance review they haven't finished grading. Ethan hadn't said anything, because there wasn't anything to say that wasn't either inadequate or obvious. "Monroe does it worse than most," she'd added. "He's very good at support that isn't." That conversation had been 4 days ago. He'd been thinking about it since. On the Thursday morning the shooting happened, Ethan arrived at 5:40 as usual and did his walk of the 47th floor as usual and noted nothing out of the ordinary, which meant the camera on the east corridor was still dark and the energy in the building was still the particular strain of normal that people maintain when they're waiting for something. He checked in with the overnight security team, reviewed the access logs from the previous 16 hours, and went to the small break room to make coffee because the machine in the security office had broken 2 days ago and no one had fixed it yet. He was standing in the break room doorway with a mug when he heard Monroe in the adjacent corridor on a phone call. Monroe's voice was usually controlled, the measured, middle-register delivery of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms. At 6:12 in the morning, alone in what he thought was an empty corridor, it was something else, not loud, but tight. The particular tightness of someone having a conversation they couldn't afford to have at the volume they wanted. Ethan stood completely still. He caught fragments. A name, Richard, spoken with the familiarity of someone who didn't need to use a last name. A phrase that sounded like "before the review," and then something about too much exposure, and then Monroe saying clearly, "It needs to be done, not another accident, done." Then footsteps, moving away. Ethan stayed where he was for 30 seconds. Then he went back to the security office and wrote down every word he'd heard, verbatim, with the time and date, and photographed the page. He thought about Richard for most of the next hour. The name appeared once in the documents Claire had been feeding him. Richard Calloway, listed as a significant minority shareholder, and listed on the advisory board of a private equity firm that held a position in Sterling Technologies. He wasn't a name that appeared in daily operations. He was the kind of name that appeared in quarterly filings and annual reports, the kind of presence that was structural rather than visible. He ran a search on Calloway through what he had access to and made a list of what he didn't have access to yet, and that list was long enough to be its own problem. Amelia arrived at 7:40, later than usual, and when she came through the service elevator, which they'd agreed she would use until the main car's cable had been independently inspected and cleared, she had the look of someone who'd been up too long before they arrived, rather than someone who'd just woken up. There was a tension around her mouth that she was managing but not fully concealing. "Bad night?" he asked, falling into step beside her chair. "Board meeting this afternoon," she said. "Pre-meeting call this morning. 2 of the independent directors are pushing for what they're calling a leadership stability review, which is code for reconsidering your position. Code for reconsidering whether they can manufacture enough concern to push me out before the quarterly review." She stopped outside her office door. 3 weeks ago, I would have called that paranoid. Now I think it might be the actual plan. It might be part of it. He held the door for her. "I need to tell you something I heard this morning." He told her about Monroe's phone call. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her qualities that he'd come to rely on, the capacity to take in information without filling the space around it with reaction. When he finished, she said, "Richard Calloway." "You know him?" "I know of him. He was close to the previous CEO, my predecessor, Martin Hale. When Hale stepped down and I was appointed, Calloway made exactly one public statement about confidence in the board's decision and then went very quiet. She was looking at something on her desk without seeing it. He holds 4.8% of outstanding shares. Is that enough to matter? In a contested vote with the right allies, yes." She looked up at him. "If Monroe and Calloway are coordinating, and if they've been working the independent directors, and if they can get enough board votes before the quarterly review, they don't need another accident," Ethan said. "They just need the board to act first." She was quiet. "The accidents were insurance," he said, working it out as he spoke. "Or a pressure campaign. Make the building feel unsafe, make it look like your leadership is creating instability, push the board toward a vote. If the vote doesn't work..." He stopped. "Then they finish what the crash started," Amelia said. Her voice was steady. "That's what Monroe meant. Done. Not an accident. Done." The words sat between them. "I need to reach out to an outside contact," Ethan said. "Someone former military who does private intelligence work, completely outside the company. I want a full background on Calloway and his connection to Monroe going back at least 5 years. That'll cost money. I'll cover it." She looked at him with an expression he was getting better at reading, the one where she was deciding whether to push back on something or let it go. She let it go. "All right, do it." He was almost at the door when she said, "Ethan." He stopped. "Be careful." She said it simply, without drama. "I mean that specifically, not generally." He nodded and left. The board meeting was at 2:00, and it was exactly as bad as she'd anticipated. Ethan stood in his corner and watched 6 faces arrange themselves around a conference table with the collective energy of people who'd already had the real meeting somewhere else. The 2 independent directors, Hargrove and Patel, spent the first 15 minutes raising what they called operational concerns about security and physical risk management within the building, which landed on Amelia like exactly what it was, the opening of a formal record. Monroe supported the concerns with careful, measured language. He expressed no personal opinion. He facilitated. He asked clarifying questions that were not actually questions. He was very good at it. Amelia answered everything directly. She presented incident reports, cited the ongoing investigation, noted that external security had been brought in, meaning Ethan, and outlined a set of operational responses. She was precise and prepared, and it didn't matter, because the point of the meeting wasn't information. The point was the record. Afterward, in the corridor, Hargrove stopped Amelia with the particular solicitousness of someone delivering a blow carefully. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who'd spent so long in boardrooms that he'd started to confuse politeness with kindness. "Amelia," he said, "no one here questions your capabilities. But the board has a fiduciary responsibility, and the pattern of incidents in this building has been formally reported and is under active investigation, Amelia said, which is in the documentation I provided today. Of course. Of course. He nodded. We just want to make sure you have the support you need. This is a stressful time. After everything you've been through personally, thank you, Gerald. Her voice was perfectly professional. I'll look forward to the minutes from today's meeting. She rolled past him toward the elevator. Ethan fell in beside her. He didn't say anything because she hadn't asked him to say anything, and sometimes the most useful thing was silence. In the elevator, the service elevator, the one they'd confirmed was clean, she pressed the button for 47 and stared at the doors. The line of her jaw was doing the thing it did when she was holding something tight. Her hands on the wheels were still. After everything I've been through personally, she repeated, quiet, flat. He said that like it was a kindness. People like Hargrove have a way of framing concern, so it looks like support. He's going to vote to remove me. She said it without inflection. I don't know when, but he's going to. And when he does, he's going to feel genuinely sorry about it, and that's the worst part somehow. She looked at the floor indicator. I keep thinking, if I could just move faster, get the evidence in front of someone who can act on it before the vote. We're close, Ethan said. How close? He thought about the 14 pages in his jacket pocket, about Monroe's phone call and Calloway's name, and the maintenance records and the camera on the East Corridor that he'd spent the previous evening doing something about, quietly, in a way that Monroe's people wouldn't notice for at least another few days. Close enough that they're feeling it, which is why Monroe is telling someone to get it done. She absorbed that. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. Then we need to move faster than they do, she said, and rolled out. The call from his intelligence contact came back the following morning with a summary that filled in gaps Ethan hadn't known were there. Richard Calloway and Adrian Monroe had overlapping history going back 8 years. A previous company, a private technology firm where both had held senior positions, which had been acquired in a deal that had made both men significant money, and which, according to his contact's deep background, had involved a third senior executive being pushed out under circumstances that had never been formally investigated but were consistent with a pattern: manufactured documentation, internal pressure, a board that moved before anyone could respond. They'd done this before. Ethan sat with that for a long time. Then he read the second part of the summary, which covered the 6 months since Amelia's crash, and by the time he finished, he was not sitting anymore. He was standing at the window looking at Chicago from the 47th floor and feeling the very specific anger of someone who has confirmed something they'd hoped they were wrong about. The vehicle inspection report from the crash. His contact had found a copy through a source he didn't name, from the independent forensic examiner hired by the insurance carrier, not the police. The police report had closed with driver error. The insurance examiner's report, which had never been forwarded to the police, and which someone had made significant effort to ensure stayed buried, found evidence of brake line compromise consistent with deliberate interference. Amelia's driver had not made an error. Her brakes had been cut. He went to find her. He told her in her office with the door closed and her phone face down and the city visible through the windows behind her, gray and flat under an October sky. He told her clearly, in order, without softening it, because she'd been direct with him from the start, and he owed her the same. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. The driver, she said finally. Marcus. He died in the crash. He had a family. She said it to herself more than to him. 2 kids, a daughter in college. She stopped. Another silence. They called it his fault. Yes. His family has been living with that for 6 months. Yes. She turned her chair away from him, toward the windows. He let her have that. Some things needed a moment of space before they became actionable, and he'd learned the difference between a silence that needed filling and one that didn't. After a while, she said, without turning around, I almost quit last week. He didn't respond immediately. After the board meeting? After Hargrove said what he said. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it. I sat in this office at 9 o'clock at night, and I thought, What am I holding on for? The company? I built this company, but I can't even walk through it. The board is going to vote me out anyway. Every person I trusted before the crash has either left or turned, and She stopped. I'm tired, Ethan. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. I know. Do you? He thought about what to say. He was not naturally a talker, the opposite usually, and the instinct when someone said something like that was to offer something practical, something actionable, because action was the vocabulary he was most fluent in, but she hadn't asked him for action. She told him something true, and she was waiting. Yeah, he said. I know what that kind of tired feels like. She turned back around. There was something in her face that was open in a way it hadn't been before. Not vulnerable, that wasn't the right word, more like unguarded. A door that had been held shut for a while moved slightly off its latch. You lost someone, she said. Not a question. My wife, 4 years ago. He said it plainly. She died while I was deployed. A car accident back home. Sophia was 5. He paused. I spent about 3 months after I got back being so angry I couldn't think. And then I spent another 3 months doing nothing. And then one morning Sophia climbed into my lap at 6 a.m. and put a book in my hands and said, "Read it, Daddy." And I understood that I didn't have the option of disappearing because there was someone who needed me not to. Amelia was watching him. There was something quiet in her face. I'm not saying you have someone who needs you in the same way, he said. I'm saying the crash didn't finish you. The board isn't going to finish you. These people have been trying for 6 months, and you're still sitting in that office doing the work. He met her eyes. The thing I've noticed about you is you're still fighting even when you say you're not. She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted, barely perceptible, like a small interior rearrangement. Marcus's family, she said. When this is over, I want to make it right. We'll make it right. She nodded once, a small motion. Then she straightened and the unguarded quality receded. Not gone, but put somewhere more organized. What do we need to do? I need access to the full financial records for the operational restructuring proposal. Everything Monroe filed internally. And I need Claire. You have Claire. I need her to go looking for something specific. Payment records, external transfers, anything that connects a Sterling Technologies account to Callaway's firm in the last 12 months. He thought for a moment. And the false maintenance records, Shay D. Paulson, J. Harmon. Someone created those entries. Someone with HR right access and system access at the same time. That's a short list of people. I can pull the access log for who had those permissions. Do it from a personal device, not your company laptop. She pulled her personal phone from her bag and started on it without comment. That was the moment the window behind her desk exploded inward. The sound was enormous, and not what people who've never been near it expect. Not a single crack, but a cascade. The glass fragmenting in a lateral burst, the curtain rod snapping loose, a chunk of the window frame separating from the wall. Ethan was moving before the sound fully registered, 3 strides across the office, and he came down over the back of Amelia's wheelchair with his body covering hers as the second shot came through and took out the monitor on her desk. He got them moving, pushing the chair hard toward the interior wall, away from the window line, using his body as the rearmost barrier, the way he'd been trained to move a principal in an active shooter situation. The desk between them and the window. The interior wall. Down. Stay low, he said, and his voice came out completely flat, which was what happened when training took over from everything else. I'm in a wheelchair, she said from under his arm. Her voice was shaking slightly. Low is my default. A third shot. It hit somewhere above them. The wall? High, which meant the shooter was adjusting angle, which meant the original position wasn't giving clean lines into the new location. Ethan pulled his phone and dialed 911 with one hand while keeping the other on the back of the chair. Active shooter, Sterling Technologies, 47th floor, northwest window exposure. I need police, and I need them now. He gave the address, gave his name, stayed on the line for the 15 seconds they needed, and then said, I have to secure my principal, and put the phone in his pocket. Can you see anything? Amelia's voice was still shaking, but she was holding herself together by main force, which he could feel in the tension of her posture. Not from here, which means they can't see us either. He scanned the room. The interior wall was solid. The door to the corridor was 12 feet to their left, open, which was a problem. We need to move to the corridor. When I say move, we go fast and we stay close to the interior wall. Don't stop for anything. Okay? You ready? A brief pause. Yes. Move. They got to the corridor. He pulled the office door shut behind them and moved them 40 feet down the hall to the server room, which had a solid door with a keypad lock and no exterior windows. He got the door open. Claire had given him the code 3 days ago for reasons that now seemed providential, and got them inside. He locked the door. The server room was cold and loud with the white noise of cooling systems. Amelia sat in her chair in the middle of the room and looked at her hands for a moment. There was a cut on the back of her left hand from a fragment of something, glass probably, that was bleeding into a thin line across her knuckles. She hadn't mentioned it. He found a first aid kit mounted on the wall and brought it to her. She looked at it and then at him. "You're cut too," she said. He looked down. There was a gash along his right forearm that he hadn't felt yet. He hadn't noticed it at all. "It's fine. It's bleeding. So is yours." He held out the kit. She took it, and he watched her work the clasp open and pull out gauze with hands that had stopped shaking, mostly, and he thought, not for the first time but more clearly than before, that Amelia Hart was not a person who fell apart. She was a person who got through the falling part and then started thinking about what came next before anyone expected her to. He took the gauze she offered him for his arm and pressed it down and held it. "A sniper," she said quietly. "They sent a sniper. From the building across the alley. The angle was wrong for anything further." He thought through it. "They had eyes on your office. They knew where you sit, they knew your schedule, they knew which window." He stopped. Monroe's phone call. Not another accident. Done. Amelia was very still. "They're done being patient," she said. "Yes." She looked at the server room door. Outside, somewhere distant, sirens were beginning. She looked back at him, and there was something in her face that was not fear. It had moved past fear into something harder and angrier and more purposeful. "They were going to kill me," she said. "Yes." "Because I'm close to finding it." She wasn't asking. "Because you're close to finding it. And they know. They know something changed. They don't know exactly what." He thought about the 14 pages and the insurance report in Calloway's name. "But they're not wrong." She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular precision of someone who made major decisions quickly. "We need everything off company systems, everything I have access to, everything Claire has, tonight, on personal devices and off-site." She looked at him. "Can we do that?" "With Claire's help, yes." "Then we do it tonight." She set the first aid kit on her knee. "And Ethan, the board is going to use this. The shooting. They're going to say the company is in crisis, that my leadership is creating risk for employees, that for everyone's safety. I know. They're going to move for a vote." Her jaw was set. "Which means we have less time than we thought." He looked at her. This woman, sitting in a server room with a cut on her hand and glass in her hair and the remnants of a very controlled terror moving out of her face to make room for something more like resolve. And he thought about what she'd said earlier. About almost quitting. About being tired in the way that sleep didn't fix. She didn't look tired right now. She looked like someone who'd just had the situation clarified in a way that removed any remaining ambiguity about what needed to happen. "We'll move faster than they do," he said, giving her words back to her. She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was what a smile looked like when someone was managing too many things for a full smile to be available. But it was there. "Yes," she said, "we will." Outside, the sirens were getting closer. Ethan pressed the gauze against his arm and listened to them come, and thought about Monroe on a phone call at 6 in the morning saying done, and thought about a 14-page legal pad in his jacket pocket, and thought about the distance between close and finished and how much could happen in that gap. Too much could happen in that gap. He needed to close it before Monroe and Calloway understood exactly how close they actually were. The board called an emergency session 48 hours after the shooting. Ethan wasn't in the room for that one. He was in the building, but the session was closed. No staff, no security personnel, principals only, which was itself a deviation from protocol that he noted and filed. Amelia had told him about it the night before, sitting in the lobby of her apartment building, because she hadn't wanted to discuss it on any device connected to a network, and she described the meeting notice with the flatness she used when something was exactly as bad as she'd expected. They called it under the emergency governance clause, she'd said, which requires a 2/3 majority just to convene. That means at least 6 board members voted to call it. How many total? 9. She'd looked at the lobby floor. I need 5 votes to survive whatever they're about to propose. I'm not sure I have them. He'd sat with that. Then, do you know which way Hargrove is going? Hargrove is going wherever Monroe pointed him. She'd looked up then, and there was something in her eyes that was different from the first weeks he'd known her. Less armored somehow. Not weaker, but more honest. Like the shooting had burned off a layer of something she'd been maintaining. He called me this morning, said he wanted me to know he was going to propose a temporary transfer of operational authority to an interim management committee, pending the outcome of the police investigation. She'd paused. He used the word protective 3 times. Protective measure, protective step, protective decision. Like he was doing me a favor by taking my company. He might genuinely believe that. That's what makes it worse, she'd exhaled. If I survive the vote, I buy us maybe 2 weeks before they try again. If I don't, you survive the vote, he'd said. Not a prediction. More like a decision he was making. She'd looked at him. You don't control the vote. No, but I control what happens before it. What happened before it was 41 hours of the hardest work Ethan had done outside of a combat zone. And some of it was harder than that because in a combat zone, the objective was usually clear and the obstacles were things you could shoot at. These obstacles were spreadsheets and encrypted emails and financial transfer records and a paper trail so deliberately fractured that whoever had built it had counted on no single person ever having all the pieces at once. Claire had started pulling records the night of the shooting. She'd done it from home, on her personal laptop, using credentials she'd never registered to any company system. And when Ethan had asked how she'd set that up, she'd said, I set it up 4 months ago, and looked at him with the expression of someone who'd been doing their own version of the same investigation and had been waiting for someone competent enough to share it with. You suspected before I got here, he said. I suspected the week after the crash. She was at her kitchen table, the laptop open, a legal pad of her own beside it. I knew Marcus. He drove Amelia for 3 years. I watched him drive. He was the most careful man I've ever seen behind a wheel. She took her reading glasses off and set them on the table. When they said driver error, I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say, and I was scared, and I've been angry at myself about that for 6 months. You're saying something now. I'm doing something now, she corrected. There's a difference. There was, and he respected it. Over the following 36 hours, Claire fed him files in batches, financial records, internal communications, meeting logs, expense reports. She had an accountant's eye for anomaly, which turned out to be exactly what the records needed, because Monroe and Calloway had not been careless so much as they'd been arrogant, and arrogance leaves a different kind of trace than carelessness. Arrogance assumes no one will look. It builds structures that are internally consistent because they're designed to withstand a casual audit, not a determined one. They found the first transfer on the second night. It was small, $42,000, routed from a Sterling Technologies operational account to a facilities management vendor that, when Ethan ran the vendor ID against the state business registry, had been registered 8 months ago under a name that traced back through 2 shell layers to a holding company in which Calloway's firm held a controlling interest. He called his intelligence contact at 11 at night. His contact was not happy about the hour. Ethan told him what he had and what he needed, and his contact said, "Give me until morning," and hung up. By morning, the holding company had a history. It had been used in 3 previous transactions, all involving companies where Monroe had held a senior position. One of those companies was the technology firm from 8 years ago, the one with the executive who'd been pushed out. His contact sent the records in a compressed file with a note that said simply, Pattern established. This will hold up. Ethan printed everything at a copy shop 4 blocks from his apartment because he was not printing any of this on any machine connected to the building. He paid cash. He carried the printouts in a legal accordion folder that he kept with the 14-page legal pad in a backpack that did not leave his body. On the morning of the board session, he met Amelia and Claire in the parking structure of a hotel 2 blocks from Sterling Technologies, in the corner furthest from the entrance ramp, under a camera that Claire had confirmed to him was non-functional. She'd checked the hotel's maintenance records, which was either impressive or alarming, depending on how you looked at it. He laid the documents out on the trunk of Claire's car and walked them through it. All of it, the transfers, the holding company, the shell layer, the previous pattern. The maintenance records with the ghost technicians, the insurance examiner's report that had never reached the police. Monroe's phone call, transcribed. Calloway's history with Monroe going back 8 years. Amelia read without interrupting. Claire had already seen most of it, but read it again, carefully, in sequence. When they finished, neither of them spoke immediately. Then Claire said, "The transfers alone are wire fraud." "Yes." "And the insurance report—" Amelia stopped. She had the examiner's report in her hands, and she was looking at the conclusion page. "If this reaches the right investigator, it's enough to open a federal investigation." Ethan had talked to a lawyer friend the previous evening, off the record. "The question is timing. If we go to the FBI right now, the investigation takes months. Monroe and Calloway know they're exposed. They'll move on the board vote before it can be stopped, take operational control, and spend those months with lawyers obscuring everything. So we need the board first," Amelia said. "We need the board to see this before the vote, before Monroe can frame it." He paused. "And we need to make sure Monroe knows we have it at a moment when he can't act on that knowledge." Claire looked at him over her glasses. "That's a narrow window." "Very narrow." Amelia set the examiner's report down. She was looking at the spread of documents across the trunk of the car with the focused expression of someone calculating distances. "The board session starts at 2 o'clock. Monroe will be in his office until at least 1:30. He has a call with the Pacific Rim legal team at noon." She paused. "How do you want to do this?" Ethan had been thinking about it for the past 12 hours. "I want to get a copy of everything to each board member directly, not through company systems. Physical copies delivered to their personal addresses this morning with a cover letter that tells them what they're looking at and asks them to be prepared to raise questions before any vote is called." He looked at Claire. "I need the personal addresses." "I have them," she said immediately. He looked at her. "I told you," she said. 4 months ago." He almost smiled. "I need drivers. People I trust, not connected to the building." "I have 2, Amelia said. "Former employees I kept contact with after they left the company. Neither of them has any reason to protect Monroe." "Get them here by 10. She was already on her phone. He mocked. The deliveries went out between 10:15 and 12:40. 7 board members, 7 physical envelopes, 7 cover letters that Ethan had written at 4 in the morning in language that was direct and sourced and contained not a single word that couldn't be backed up by a document in the package. He'd had Amelia read it twice and Claire read it once, and Claire had changed 2 sentences for precision, and he'd accepted both changes. He didn't know if it would work. That was the honest truth. He'd done what could be done with the evidence and the time available, and now there were 7 people reading documents in 7 locations across Chicago, and the outcome depended on how they read and what they decided and how much courage they had or didn't have, and that part was outside his control. He was better at things inside his control, and he'd been sitting with the outside his control part since the deliveries went out, and it sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't put down. He was in the hotel parking structure again, alone with the accordion folder and his phone, when the call came in from a number he didn't recognize. He answered it on the second ring. "Carter?" The voice was male, professional, flat in a way that had been trained into it. "You don't know me. I'm calling from inside the building. You need to know that Monroe was informed this morning that you've been gathering records. Someone in the legal department." Ethan was already moving toward his car. "When?" "Hour ago. Maybe more." A pause. "He made 2 calls after. I don't know to who, but he was not calm." "Do you know where he is now?" "His office, last I saw." Thank you. He hung up. He called Amelia. She picked up on the first ring. Monroe knows, he said. Get out of wherever you are and go directly to the building. Use the loading dock entrance. Don't go through the lobby. A brief silence. I'm 6 blocks away. I'll meet you at the loading dock in 8 minutes. He drove fast and parked badly and got to the loading dock in 7. Marcus at the security desk, the same Marcus who'd looked at Ethan on his first morning with the expression of a man watching someone walk into a burning building, buzzed him through without being asked and said quietly, Something's wrong in the building today, man. I don't know what, but it feels wrong. It is wrong, Ethan said. Stay at your desk and don't let anyone in that you don't personally recognize. Not contractors, not vendors, not anyone. Marcus nodded slowly. That bad? That bad. Amelia arrived 90 seconds later. She came through the loading dock in her chair and looked at him and read whatever was in his face and said, How bad? Monroe is moving. I don't know what he's planning, but the timeline just compressed. He thought fast. The board session is in 3 hours. We need to be in that building, and we need to stay in that building, and we need to be very careful between now and 2 o'clock. Understood. She adjusted her grip on her wheels. Claire's already upstairs. They took the service elevator to 47. Mazsim. He almost missed it. That was the thing that stayed with him afterward, the detail that he turned over in the hours and days following. How close it came to going a completely different way because of a 90-second conversation. At 12:50, he was in Amelia's office while she was on a call with her attorney, who had received a copy of the document package and was going through the wire fraud exposure with the contained excitement of a lawyer who'd just been handed something very good. Ethan was watching the corridor through the glass panel beside the office door, running through variables, when his phone buzzed with a text from Claire. Monroe just left his office, headed toward the parking structure, not taking his regular car. He told Amelia he'd be back, and went. He took the stairs to the parking structure level, which was 2 floors below ground, because he wanted to come in from the stairwell side and not the elevator side, and because stairs were quieter and gave him a view of more of the space before he was visible in it. He pushed the stairwell door open 6 inches and looked through the gap. The parking structure was mostly empty at this hour. Executive level, reserved spaces. Monroe was standing near the far wall, by the fire door that led to the building's utility corridor. He wasn't alone. There were 3 men Ethan didn't recognize. None of them were in business attire. They had the physical quality, the particular way of standing, the way their eyes moved, that Ethan recognized from a professional context that had nothing to do with corporate management. He'd worked alongside men who stood like that. He'd been sent against men who stood like that. Monroe was talking. His voice didn't carry across the space, but his posture did. A man giving instructions, not asking questions. One of the 3 men nodded. Monroe handed something over. A phone or a card. Ethan couldn't see clearly. Then Monroe walked back toward the elevator bank without looking back. The 3 men stayed where they were. Ethan let the stairwell door close silently and went back up the stairs fast. He called his contact on the way. I need you to send what we established on Callaway to the FBI field office in Chicago. Full package now, not later. I thought you needed the board first. I need both, and I need them simultaneously. He was moving. How fast can you get it there? I can file digitally in 20 minutes. Do it. He hung up. He called Amelia's attorney. He described what he'd seen in 3 sentences and said, We need someone from federal law enforcement in that building before 2 o'clock. I need to know who you call to make that happen. The attorney, to his credit, did not ask clarifying questions. Give me 15 minutes. Bet. Ethan found Claire at her desk and pulled her into the copy room adjacent to her office and shut the door. Monroe just met with 3 people in the parking structure, he said. They're still down there. Claire went still. Mercenaries. I don't know that. Monroe used contract security for the incidents before. If he's escalating, she stopped herself. What do you need? The building's internal security team. How many people does Marcus have on duty right now? 4, maybe 5 with the afternoon shift starting. I need them all deployed to the executive level and the parking structure before 1 o'clock, without it looking like a deployment. He thought, Can you get facilities to run a drill? Fire alarm test, something that puts people in the corridors without triggering an evacuation? I can do that. She was already reaching for her desk phone. Don't use the building system. Use your cell. She picked up her cell. He went back to Amelia. She was off the call with her attorney. She had the document package open on her desk, not the company laptop, her personal tablet, and she was reading something with the focused intensity she brought to things that mattered. She looked up when he came in. Your attorney is working on getting someone from the FBI field office here, he said. It may not happen before the board session. We need to be ready for both scenarios. Both scenarios being... She stopped. If federal agents are here before 2, we have cover. If they're not, we walk into the board session with what we have and we present it before Monroe can control the room. He paused. If the board sees it before Monroe can frame it, some of them will vote correctly. Maybe enough. And if some of them have already been told what to do, then we deal with that when it happens. She looked at him for a moment. You're not certain this works. I'm not certain of anything. She nodded slowly. Okay. She closed the tablet. I appreciate that. He sat across from her desk, which was something he rarely did. His position was usually near the door. She noticed. You're worried, she said. I'm always worried. You're more worried. He considered not answering and then answered anyway. The men in the parking structure. I don't know what Monroe told them to do, and I don't know when. That's the variable I can't plan around fully. She was quiet for a moment. Were you ever in situations like this overseas? Where you had variables you couldn't plan around? Constantly. What did you do? Made the best plan I could with what I had, committed to it completely, and adapted when it fell apart. He paused. And it usually fell apart somewhere. She almost smiled. That's a terrible thing to say to someone an hour before the most important meeting of her life. It's also true. He met her eyes. The plan is good. The evidence is solid. The variables are the variables. But you've been running toward this for 6 months, and so have I, and that counts for something. She held his gaze for a moment, and in that moment there was something in the space between them that hadn't been there at the beginning. Not in the formal way, not in the way that gets said out loud, but in the way that happens between two people who've been through enough together that the distance between them has changed shape without either one deciding it should. She looked away first, back at her tablet, and he looked at the door, and neither of them said anything about it. The ambush happened at 1:17 p.m. Ethan had gone to the parking structure himself to check the positions of the 3 men. He wanted to know if they'd moved, if they were still in the building, what configuration they'd taken. He'd gone alone because taking anyone with him would have signaled the check. And he went armed, which he was licensed to be, and which he'd been every day since starting this assignment. He came off the stairwell and into the parking structure and understood within 4 seconds that they'd been waiting for him specifically. The first one came from behind a support pillar on his left. Ethan heard the movement before he saw it. A shift in the ambient sound of the space, the specific way footsteps change when someone has been standing still. And he turned and got his forearm up in time to redirect the strike rather than absorb it fully, which was the difference between a broken arm and a bruised one. He took the hit on the outside of his forearm, let the momentum carry him into a turn, and put the man off balance with the turn. The second one came from his right, which was the direction he'd anticipated from the moment the first moved, because this was a two-side approach, and he'd trained against this configuration enough times that his body had its own response protocol. He stepped inside the reach, which removed the leverage from the swing, and got enough of a grip on the man's jacket to use the forward momentum against him. The third one was the problem. He was further back, standing near a concrete pillar with what looked like a taser, waiting for Ethan to be occupied with the first two, which was smart positioning. Ethan got the second man between himself and the third one, which delayed the taser option but didn't eliminate it, and then there was a period of roughly 90 seconds that he would later struggle to describe in sequence because it wasn't sequential. It was simultaneous, overlapping, each decision creating the next problem. He got the second man down. He put enough distance between himself and the first to buy time. The third one moved to flank. Ethan dropped behind a parked car, which gave him cover and forced the third man to reposition, which gave him a window. He came up and moved and got to the third man before the third man had finished the repositioning. And at close range, the taser was a liability to its user, rather than an asset. He subdued the man with the taser and secured him with zip ties from the small kit he carried in his jacket. The kind of low-profile emergency kit that people in his former profession never fully stopped carrying. He went back to the other two. The second was still down. The first was on his feet and moving toward the stairwell door. Ethan made a decision about the first man that involved his car keys and the SUV parked in the executive space closest to the door, which he used to block the stairwell door before the first man could reach it, and then a second decision that he'd rather not detail, but which left the first man seated against the concrete wall with zip ties on his wrists and a look on his face that had passed through aggression and arrived somewhere more calculating. Ethan stood over all three of them and tried to control his breathing. His right shoulder was going to hurt tomorrow. His forearm from the first hit was already swelling. The gash on his arm from the shooting, which hadn't fully closed, had reopened. "I'm going to ask you once," he said to the man who'd carried the taser, who seemed to be the one most inclined toward assessment rather than anger. "Who contracted you?" The man looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I want a lawyer." "You'll get one." Ethan crouched to his level. "Right now, you're looking at assault and conspiracy charges, and I'm offering you a window to separate yourself from a wire fraud and attempted murder case that is going to federal court. One name, that's all I need." The man was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "Calloway, Richard Calloway. We were hired through a cutout, but it traces back to Calloway." He paused. "Monroe was a client too, but the money came from Calloway." Ethan stood. He called Marcus, gave him the location, and told him to bring 2 of his team down. Then he called Amelia's attorney and said, "I have 2 individuals in custody in the parking structure who are willing to provide statements connecting Calloway and Monroe to the conspiracy. I need someone from federal law enforcement here in the next 30 minutes." The attorney said, "They're already in the building. They arrived 8 minutes ago." Ethan exhaled. Just once, and not dramatically, but he felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight for a very long time. "Tell them the parking structure," he said. "Level B2. He stayed with the 3 men until Marcus arrived with 2 members of his team, and when they had it secured, he went back up the stairs to 47 and down the corridor to Amelia's office and opened the door. She looked at him, his forearm, his shoulder, the general state of him. "Parking structure," he said. "How many?" 3. 2 in custody. 1. He stopped. "One got out through the utility corridor before I could secure him, but the other 2 are talking." She stared at him. "You did that alone." There wasn't time to wait. "Ethan!" Her voice had something in it he hadn't heard from her before. Not anger, not relief, something that was both and neither. "You could have been killed." "I could have," he agreed. "I wasn't." She looked at him for a long moment, with the particular look of someone who wanted to say something and was calculating the cost of saying it. She made a decision and said, "Don't do that again without telling me first." He understood that she didn't mean the operational piece. "Okay," he said. She looked at the clock on her wall. 1:43, 17 minutes to the board session. Federal agents in the building. 2 men in the parking structure who were already talking. A document package in the hands of 7 board members. She straightened in her chair, adjusted her jacket, put her tablet in the bag across the back of her wheelchair. "I need to go to a board meeting," she said. "I'll be in the room." "I know." She moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back at him. "You look terrible, by the way." "I'm aware." "Go wash the blood off your arm before you come in. I need the board focused on the documents, not on my bodyguard looking like he lost a fight in a parking garage." "I didn't lose," he said. "I know you didn't." She was already moving. "Wash your arm." He went to wash his arm, and by the time he came out, Amelia Hart was already heading down the corridor toward the conference room, straight-backed and composed, rolling forward with the steady certainty of someone who had decided how this was going to end and was going to see it through to the last word. The conference room on the 47th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides and a long oval table that seated 14. And when Amelia rolled through the door at 1:58 p.m., every person already seated looked up with the particular attentiveness of people who had spent the last hour reading documents that had fundamentally changed what they thought they knew about why they were there. She could feel it in the room before anyone said a word. 7 of the 9 board members were present. Hargrove was at the far end, his silver hair and careful posture arranged in the familiar configuration of a man who had already decided his position and was managing his expression to conceal it. Patel sat 2 seats to his left, and Patel, unlike Hargrove, was not managing his expression. He looked like someone who had swallowed something unpleasant and was still deciding whether to name it. The other 5 ranged across various points on a spectrum between unsettled and grim. Monroe was not there. That was the first thing. The absence was a physical fact, like a chair pulled away from a table. The space where he should have been created its own kind of presence. Amelia noted it, processed it, and took her position at the head of the table without commenting on it. Ethan positioned himself near the door as always, and now she found the specific location of him in the room. The corner, the stillness, the damaged forearm that he'd wrapped in the building's first aid room and which he was clearly not thinking about. And it steadied something in her that she hadn't known needed steadying. Board member Renata Okafor, who ran a manufacturing firm and who had been, in Amelia's experience, the most straightforwardly practical person on the board, said without preamble, "We received packages this morning." "I know," Amelia said. "I've been on the phone with my attorney for the past hour." Renata had the documents in front of her, the physical printouts, and she set her hand flat on them. "The wire transfer documentation is not ambiguous." "No," Amelia said. "It isn't." Hargrove cleared his throat. "We should wait for Adrian." "Adrian Monroe," said a voice from the doorway, "is currently being questioned by federal agents in the building's security office." The voice belonged to a woman in a dark jacket whom Ethan had escorted to the door. Special Agent Diana Reyes of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, who had been in the building for 40 minutes and who delivered that sentence with the professional economy of someone who said difficult things for a living and had stopped being interested in the reaction. The room went very quiet. Hargrove's face did something complicated. He looked at Amelia, then at the agent, then at the documents in front of him that he'd clearly read and just as clearly been hoping to compartmentalize. "Richard Calloway," Agent Reyes continued, stepping into the room, "was detained at O'Hare Airport 40 minutes ago attempting to board a flight to Zurich. He's being transported to the federal field office." She looked around the table. "I'm not here to conduct your board meeting. I'm here to inform you that this is now an active federal investigation and that any individual in this room who has knowledge of the conduct described in those documents and has not yet disclosed it to law enforcement would be well advised to speak with their attorney before this meeting proceeds further." She looked at Hargrove when she said that last part. Not obviously, not in a way that could be called pointed, but she looked at him. Hargrove's hand, Amelia noticed, was very still on the table. "I'll be outside," Agent Reyes said and left. The silence that followed lasted about 10 seconds, which is a very long time in a room full of people who are recalibrating. Amelia sat at the head of the table and let it breathe. She'd spent a lot of the past several weeks preparing for this room and this moment, and she'd imagined it going many ways, but what she hadn't fully prepared for was how tired she felt sitting here, how the absence of the immediate threat, Monroe's chair empty, Calloway on a federal transport, 3 men in a parking structure whose presence had been the final piece, didn't produce the triumph she'd expected. It produced something quieter and more complicated, something closer to grief, maybe, or to the particular exhaustion of a long chase that has finally ended and left you standing in a field you don't yet know how to walk home from. She thought about Marcus, the driver. 18 years of clean experience and a family that had been living for 6 months with the weight of a false verdict. She thought about that and let it settle, and then she looked at the board members around the table and started to work. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was not the meeting anyone had anticipated convening that morning. The emergency governance clause, the proposal for interim management authority, the carefully arranged presentation that Monroe had spent weeks constructing, all of that dissolved in the first 20 minutes as the reality of the documentation spread through the room with the force of something that cannot be argued with on technical grounds. Numbers are not opinions. Wire transfers are not interpretations. A forged maintenance record is not a perspective. What followed was less a board meeting than a kind of collective accounting. with each member working through the documents in their own way and at their own pace while Amelia answered questions directly and without inflation. She did not perform confidence. She did not try to spin what had happened or minimize how close it had come to ending differently. When Patel asked how she had gathered the evidence without internal resources, she said, "I had help from the right people," and looked at the corner of the room where Ethan was standing, and Ethan looked at the middle distance in the way he always did when attention moved toward him. Renata Okafor asked about the original crash, about Marcus, about the insurance examiner's report. Amelia answered that one carefully because it was the one that cost her something to say out loud. The examiner's findings were suppressed. Marcus Delaney was cleared of fault by an independent investigation, and that investigation was buried by people in this organization who had financial motivation to ensure the police case stayed closed. She paused. His family deserves to know the truth. That's already in motion. She had called an attorney the previous evening specifically for that purpose, but I wanted this room to know it too. What happened to Marcus is part of what happened to Sterling Technologies, and anyone who was party to the decisions that led to that crash is responsible for his death. She said it and meant it and let it sit. Hargrove, by the 90-minute mark, had said almost nothing. He was a man watching the structure he'd been part of, perhaps not fully understanding how deep it went, perhaps hoping it would hold long enough for him to exit cleanly, come apart with the irreversibility of something structural. When he did speak, near the end, it was to say that he intended to retain independent counsel before making any further statements, which was both legally prudent and the most honest thing he'd said all day. When the vote was finally called, not the vote that Monroe had designed, but a ratification of Amelia's continued authority and a formal referral of all evidence to federal investigators. It was 6-1. Hargrove abstained, which was a kind of vote in itself, and Patel, who had spent the first hour looking like he'd eaten something bad, voted in Amelia's favor with the visible relief of a man who had been offered an alternative to something he hadn't wanted to do. Afterward, in the corridor outside the conference room, Renata Okafor stopped Amelia briefly. She was a tall woman with a direct manner that had always made Amelia trust her more than most. "I owe you an apology," Renata said. "You don't—" "I saw what was happening to this place, and I told myself it was a management problem, a transition problem." She paused. "I should have looked harder. I'm sorry I didn't." Amelia looked at her. "Vote the right way next time something doesn't add up." Renata nodded once, and that was all. Monroe was arrested formally at 4:47 p.m. Ethan watched it happen from the corridor outside the security office, not because he needed to, but because some things you witnessed to the end. Monroe came out in the company of 2 federal agents with the particular quality of a man who had decided composure was the only thing left worth protecting. He was in his suit, his silver hair in order, his face arranged in an expression that was probably meant to communicate steadiness but read, to anyone looking carefully, as the controlled panic of someone recalculating every variable of the past 6 months and not liking where any of them landed. He stopped when he saw Ethan. They looked at each other for a moment. Ethan didn't say anything. Monroe looked at him with the expression of a man who wanted to find something to say that would restore a balance that no longer existed. And after a few seconds, he apparently concluded there wasn't anything. And he walked out with the agents, and that was the end of him in that building. Ethan went and found a chair and sat in it. The shoulder that had taken the hit in the parking structure had stiffened badly over the course of the afternoon. The kind of stiffening that happens when adrenaline drops off, and the body begins sending invoices for everything it absorbed while you were too busy to feel it. His arm was wrapped, and the cut had stopped bleeding, but the wrap was doing some structural work. His back had something going on that he'd catalog later. He sat in the chair and looked at the hallway ceiling and thought about nothing specific for about 4 minutes, which was the closest he could manage to rest. Then Claire appeared with a cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the break room machine kind. Something she'd apparently had delivered from somewhere, because it was in a paper cup with a logo he didn't recognize, and it was hot, and it tasted like something a human being would choose to drink. He looked up at her. "Don't read into it," she said. "You look like you need it." "Thank you." She sat in the chair beside him. She had her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she looked, for the first time since he'd known her, tired in a way she wasn't managing. The kind of tired that surfaces when there's finally enough room for it. "I've worked for this company for 11 years, she said. Not to him specifically, more to the hallway. "I was here when Amelia was appointed. I watched everyone assume she'd struggle because of the chair, and then I watched her run this place better than the two men before her." She paused. "And I watched people who smiled in her face work to destroy her behind it." She shook her head. "That's a particular kind of ugly." "Yes," he said. "You knew, didn't you?" She glanced at him. "From very early on, how bad it was." "I knew it was bad. I didn't know the full shape of it until a few days ago." "But you stayed." He looked at the coffee cup. "That was always the plan." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Thank you. For what you did in that parking structure." "You don't need to—" "I do." Her voice was even. "Those men were there to make sure the evidence didn't reach the board meeting. If they'd succeeded—" She stopped. "So, thank you." He nodded. They sat in the hallway and drank their respective coffees in a silence that was, for once, not tense with anything. It was after 6 when Amelia finally closed her office door, with only Ethan inside it. The building had mostly emptied. The ordinary staff had gone home, the federal investigators had completed their initial collection and left with a sealed inventory. The last board member's car had pulled out of the executive garage. The glass in the northwest window had been boarded temporarily with plywood that gave the office the odd quality of a room in the middle of a renovation, which was, in a way, accurate. Amelia sat behind her desk and looked at the boarded window for a long time. "My attorney called," she said. "The federal case is going to take months, possibly longer. The civil side is its own whole situation." She turned from the window. "Hargrove retained counsel and is apparently negotiating a cooperation agreement, which means he knew more than he let on." "What about the insurance report? Marcus's family?" "My attorney contacted them this afternoon." She stopped. Her voice had something in it that she was holding carefully. "His daughter. She's a junior in college. She called me." Amelia stopped again. She said her family had been trying to understand how her father made a mistake he'd never made in 18 years of driving. She said her mother kept saying there must have been something going on with him that day, something they'd missed. She looked at her desk. She cried, and I didn't have anything that was adequate to say. "There isn't anything adequate." "No." She was quiet. "I told her the truth, that her father was the best driver I've ever known, and that he died because of choices other people made, and that his record is going to be formally cleared and that his family is going to be taken care of." She paused. She said thank you, and I almost couldn't stand it. She shouldn't have to thank anyone for her father's name being right. Ethan didn't say anything, because it was true, and saying so wouldn't change the weight of it. Some things don't have a response that helps. The only thing that helps is the thing that's already been done. And they'd done it, and it was still going to be a long time before Marcus Delaney's family felt anything like okay. That was the reality underneath the evidence and the board votes and the federal case. The cost of what Monroe and Calloway had done wasn't abstract. It had a specific shape, and it lived in specific people's lives. Amelia looked at him. "How's your arm?" "It's fine." "Your shoulder?" "Also fine." "You're going to say everything is fine for the next 6 hours, aren't you?" "Probably." She looked at him with something that was almost the same half-smile she'd used in the server room, but warmer, more settled. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, rather than professionally." "Okay." "Did you think this was going to work? Today? When you sent those packages out this morning and didn't know if the board would read them, or if Monroe had already gotten to enough people, or if the federal agents would arrive in time, did you think it was going to work?" He considered the question properly because she'd asked for honesty rather than confidence, and she deserved the distinction. "I thought we'd done everything that could be done. Whether it worked depended on things that weren't in my control." He paused. "I've been in situations where we did everything right and it still went wrong. In situations where we made mistakes and it still went right. The variables don't care about the effort. But you kept going anyway. Stopping wasn't an option." She held his gaze. "Why not?" He looked at her for a moment. The question underneath the question was something he'd been aware of for a while. a thing that had been developing in the shape of this assignment, in the specific way that proximity and stakes and time together build something between people that doesn't ask permission before it exists. Because you hadn't, he said. 6 months of this and you hadn't stopped. That counted for something. She was very still. And because I told someone once that I wouldn't leave a person alone when they had a chance to fight, he added, I try to keep the things I tell people. Something in her face moved in the careful, controlled way that Amelia Hart allowed things to move across her face. Not a collapse, nothing dramatic, more like a door opening a crack and choosing to stay that way. You need to go home, she said quietly. Sophia has been patient enough. She has. And you need a doctor to look at that arm, a real one. I'll go to urgent care. Tonight. Tonight, he agreed. He stood. He picked up his jacket and his backpack, the accordion folder and the 14-page legal pad that had started all of this and which had been sitting on the edge of her desk for the last hour. He held it for a moment, then set it back down. Keep that, he said. She looked at it. Why? Because you should have a record of what it actually took. She looked at the legal pad for a moment, then put her hand on it. Ethan. Yeah. What happens now with the assignment? She said it carefully, not quite casually, which meant it wasn't casual. Monroe is gone. The immediate threat is contained. Technically, the protection requirement has changed. He understood what she was actually asking. The federal case creates exposure for at least 3 months. Callaway has associates who may not like where this lands. The board needs stabilizing, the company needs stabilizing, and whoever shot through your window is still unidentified. He paused. Professionally, the assignment is far from over. And personally? He held her gaze. Personally, I think we figure that out as we go. She looked at him for a moment. Not the assessing look he'd gotten on the first morning when she'd been filing him under categories. Something different. Something that didn't need categories. Okay, she said. Go home. Come back tomorrow. I'll be here at 5:40. I know you will. She turned back to her desk. Shut the door on your way out. He shut the door on his way out. He picked Sophia up from Mrs. Kowalski's at 7:15, and she took one look at the wrapped arm and the general condition of him and said, urgent care, in exactly the tone he would have used, which was disconcerting in a 9-year-old. I was already planning on it, he said. Right now, not after dinner. Sophia, Dad. She held her ground in the doorway with her backpack on and her sneakers untied, the same crease between her eyebrows that appeared when she was being serious. Right now. They went to urgent care. It was a 2-hour wait, and Sophia spent it doing homework on her tablet with the kind of focused efficiency that only came from having been in waiting rooms before. And Ethan sat beside her and answered her questions when she had them and let her work in silence when she didn't. At one point, she put the tablet down and looked at him. You won today, she said. He looked at her. How do you know? Because you look tired like you won. You look different when things go wrong. She studied him with the directness that she hadn't learned from him, that had always been entirely her own. The lady you're protecting, is she okay? She's okay. Did you like working with her? He thought about 14 pages and 2 hours in a hotel parking structure and a server room and a woman who sat in front of a board that was trying to dismantle her and answered their questions without flinching. Yeah. Sophia nodded as if that confirmed something she'd already theorized. She picked up her tablet and went back to homework and said no more about it. And Ethan sat in the plastic chair and looked at the waiting room TV and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular sensation of a thing having been done and done right. Not perfectly. Nothing had been perfect. Not the plan, not the execution, not the outcome, which had costs and losses woven through it that would take a long time to understand fully. But done, and right, in the way that matters when you're the one who has to sleep afterward. They called his name at 9:40. He had 4 stitches in the arm, a recommendation to rest the shoulder that he noted and would partially follow, and a prescription for something he'd probably fill tomorrow. The doctor, a young woman who looked like she'd had a longer day than Ethan and was managing it less cheerfully, told him he needed to stop doing whatever he was doing for at least a week. He told her he'd consider it. She told him she'd heard that before. Sophia, in the waiting room, had fallen asleep sitting up in the plastic chair with the tablet on her lap and her head at an angle that was going to hurt her neck. He gathered her up carefully, and she woke enough to transfer her weight to him and then went back to sleep against his shoulder, and he carried her out to the car, and the night air was cold and clear, and Chicago was doing what Chicago does in October, which is assert itself. He put her in the back seat and covered her with the jacket from his bag and drove home. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in January, Amelia Hart stood in front of 600 Sterling Technologies employees in the main atrium of their Chicago headquarters and did something she had not done in the entire 7 months since her accident. She talked about the wheelchair, not about the mechanics of it, not about the medical reality of her paralysis, which was permanent and which the medical team had been clear about from the beginning. She talked about what it was like to have a thing that had always been invisible, the physical ease of moving through a space, of being at the same level as the person across the table, of not requiring any accommodation from any room you entered, become suddenly, permanently visible. About the particular experience of watching people's eyes move to the chair before they moved to her face, and making peace with the fact that some of them would never stop doing that, and deciding that it was their problem and not hers. She talked about the year she'd had, not in terms of the conspiracy. That was federal court now, depositions and evidence rooms and attorneys, a process that would run its course and produce its verdicts, but in terms of what it had taken from her and what it had given back, which were not the same things and did not cancel each other out. "I almost left," she said. "I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this speech that pretends the hard part was just the attacks, the sabotage, the board pressure. But the hard part was quieter than that. The hard part was a Tuesday night in my office when I sat alone and thought about all the reasons it would make sense to stop." She paused. "I didn't stop. I want to be careful about why I say that, because I don't think the point is that I'm particularly resilient or brave. The point is that I had the right people beside me. That made the difference. Not my own strength. The people who stayed." From his position near the atrium wall, Ethan listened to this and felt the particular discomfort of being someone who doesn't receive acknowledgement easily. Amelia hadn't named him. He'd been clear, when she'd shown him the draft of the speech, that he didn't want to be named. She'd looked at him with the look she used when she was deciding whether to push back, and then she'd removed the name, and she'd replaced it with something that landed. He understood now, more accurately anyway. The people who stayed. After the speech, in the elevator up to 47, she looked at him and said, "You're uncomfortable. I'm fine. You've been doing that thing where you look at the middle distance and pretend you're focused on security. I am focused on security. The atrium is full of employees who've been thoroughly vetted. You're hiding." He looked at her. "I'm not hiding." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm adjacent to hiding," he said. "There's a difference." She almost laughed. It was an almost laugh that had been getting closer to an actual laugh over the past 3 months, like something that had been frozen was slowly, unevenly thawing. She wasn't healed. That wasn't the word for it, and it wasn't the right idea anyway. Healed implied getting back to what something was before, and she was something different now, not diminished, just different. She knew things now that she hadn't known before the crash, and some of those things were hard, and some of them were clarifying, and none of them could be unknowed. The elevator opened. She rolled out and he followed. It was a Tuesday, which meant a 9 o'clock review with the new operations team that Monroe had left in disarray, and which Amelia had spent the past 2 months rebuilding with the patient, methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that you couldn't rush the reconstruction of trust. A noon call with the legal team on the federal case. An afternoon of quarterly planning that should have happened in October and was finally, 3 months late, happening now. An ordinary day in a place that had decided to keep going. He fell into his position beside her, which was where he'd been for 4 months now. Not in front, not behind, but beside. Which was a placement he'd arrived at without deciding to. Because it was where he ended up, and she'd never asked him to move. She stopped outside the conference room door and looked at him. The executive protection assignment formally ends in 30 days, she said, when the threat assessment clears. She said it in the neutral tone she used for information, but there was something under it that wasn't neutral. I want you to know that I've been thinking about what comes after that. He was quiet. There's a newly created position, she said. Head of corporate security. It came out of the restructuring. Actual authority, real scope, the kind of work that would be worth your time. She held his gaze. I'd like you to consider it. He considered it for a moment, watching her face, which was doing the thing it did when she was managing more than she was saying. And if I declined the position? She held his gaze. Then I'd like you to consider staying anyway. In whatever capacity makes sense. She paused. I'm aware that's not a professional offer. I'm making it anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the first morning he'd walked into this building, the weight of a job that 13 people had already walked away from, the particular instinct that had made him say yes without asking about the money. He thought about 14 pages of notes and parking structures and server rooms and 2 hours in a hospital waiting room with Sophia asleep on a plastic chair. He thought about all the ways this had been harder and more complicated and more costly than he'd known it would be going in, and how none of that had changed the fundamental calculus. I'm not taking the position, he said. She was still. I'll stay, he said. Not as your bodyguard, not as the head of security. He looked at her steadily. As the person who stands beside you, if that's still something you need. She was quiet for a long moment. The conference room was visible through the glass panel in the door. 6 people, tablets, coffee, a normal morning meeting waiting to begin. It is, she said. It is something I need. She turned and opened the door and rolled into the room, and he followed, and someone asked if they could get started, and she said yes, and the meeting began, and it was ordinary in all the ways that ordinary had become something worth protecting. Later, Ethan would think about what it meant that he had walked into Sterling Technologies on a Monday morning 4 months ago, and everything that had come after, all of it, the evidence and the fights, and the federal case and the board and the woman at the center of all of it, had come from one decision he'd made before he knew any of the particulars, before he knew about the conspiracy, or the wheelchair, or the maintenance records, or the 14 pages it would take to map the truth. He'd made the decision for the same reason people make most of the decisions that actually matter. Not because he'd calculated the odds, not because the money was right, or the conditions were favorable, or the risk had been assessed and found acceptable. Because someone needed someone to stay, and staying was something he knew how to do, and he didn't see any reason good enough not to. That was it. That was the whole thing. He'd been taught, in the years of training and deployment and everything that came after, that the most important skill in any difficult situation was the ability to read the terrain and make a fast decision and commit to it completely. What he hadn't been taught, and had learned more slowly, was that some of the most important terrains weren't the ones you could map. The ones that mattered most were the ones you had to walk through to understand, and by the time you understood them, you were already in them, and the only question left was whether you were the kind of person who turned back or the kind who kept going. He'd always been the second kind. So had she. And in a world that offered plenty of reasons to stop, that turned out to be exactly enough.